Okay, GM. Welcome back to episode number 4 of Friday Sharpeners. This is technically Saturday because I did try to record this yesterday, but um, the failing hardware came in between me and success. In any event, it's Saturday, so I would call it Saturday brunch or something like that. And it's Saturday, so you know what that means. It's auction day in Australia. We'll come back to this, but this is like the one of the craziest things about the home market is that like heaps of residential housing transactions are done in a hothouse auction environment. Bizarre. Anywho, we'll get the marketing out of the way first. Today, this week on the blog, couple of articles. There was obviously one on Korea Ratings Corporation, which is a domestics rating agency in South Korea. Unless you've been living under a rock, you know, you would have seen that Interactive Brokers opened up South Korea as a tradable market this week, and that presents interesting uh, opportunities. The Obviously people want to get want access to it to get access to the memory complex. That would be like the number one reason why people want to trade this market, and the huge like Momo recursive levered ETF complex that's being built up around it. But there are some pretty interesting small cap companies, especially in financial services land. Um, these ratings agencies that are listed, there are two of them. There's one that's non-listed. It's owned by Moody's, and it's a very typical untapped pricing power story. So very interesting. That one is a research article, so like half of the article is available for free. You can just go and read that if you like. And then Grinder reported earnings yesterday, and it's not as interesting as what's been happening last year, but it looks like they're entering a like pretty new phase of pretty strong product development at the same time that a lot of the there are regulatory barriers going up for these dating app properties, which there's implications in terms of pure MAU growth. There's implications in terms of makes the competitive environment much less friendly for newer companies and companies which aren't as scaled as much. Um, so that was actually, those were some very interesting developments. Obviously, they pushed to a big price increase this year, and they're looking to roll out Edge, which depending on when they roll it out in North America, that will also be a pretty significant uplift to monetization. So the value of a monthly active user, like they've said that they're quite surprised by how price insensitive the edge users are, and they're in cases where they've made this available to mostly to subscribers in Australia for as high as $600 a month. Imagine that, paying $600 $600 a month for a casual hookup app. Anywho, both of those are on there. Um, Go and have a look at your leisure. I'm going to pull up a tweet. Here we go. So obviously the topic of today is homes. Now, for those of you not as familiar with what a home is, it's a mentality around owning a home, especially for boomers. Home, boomer, hoomer. Um, Basically, where this comes from is, um, some people have so much wealth concentrated in their house. Some of these Australian retirees have so much wealth concentrated in their house that like literally home ownership is how they're going to fund their retirement. The value of the house is is literally tied to maybe whether or not their grandchildren can go to private school, and all these like really bizarre behavioral things that come off the back of having a singular exposure to one very concentrated asset class. So this gets like spread large over the Anglosphere. There's an American version of this. There's a UK version of this. Um, there's a Canadian version of this. There's a version of this everywhere. But this like mind virus around home ownership has just been like writ large, in recent years, and it's starting to cause like significant problems. In any event, the topic of this is HOOMS, but it's kind of a bit of an explanation about like Australia's housing situation. So when I recorded half of this yesterday, and then the audio dropped out, um, you know, I had basically started this with like a broad historical narrative. And the broad historical narrative of Australia is that it started as a penal colony for Great Britain. Um, there was the first fleet. A couple of ships pulled up with a few hundred people in Botany Bay. Bingo, bango, bongo. 150 years after that, there's six or seven crown colonies, which then all federated at the turn of the 19th century. Um, the economy has changed very considerably over time. There was a time when this was an agricultural based economy, especially in merino wool. There was a time when there was a gold rush. It was a gold rush in the late 19th century. There's been a period of time when this has been, like mostly like a minerals economy, which would be a good descriptor of it today. Um, and in this period where we have like incredibly high reliance on government welfare and employment and contracting and all that kind of thing. So the country federated in 1900 or 1901. There's I think seven states. States are aspects of the crown. They enjoy sovereignty not so different from states in the United States. And the federal government, federation, referred to as the Commonwealth of Australia, they act as a central taxation authority at the moment, and they remit a lot of the money that they raise through various forms back down to the states, so the states can fund day-to-day government services and administration. So the states slash in other places they might be called provinces, the provincial slash state governments are responsible for healthcare, education, policing, the mineral industries, and so on. There's also a local, a tertiary level of government, local government, in which, localized services are provided, like rubbish pickup and water and all that kind of thing. Um, the country's had several housing booms. There was the original housing boom, which pervaded in many places. There was an original housing boom in the late 19th century. So that kind of peaked with the absolute top in the financial bubble caused by the gold rush in the late 19th century. And there was, on an inflation adjusted, maybe I think even a nominal basis, housing went nowhere for 60 or 70 years after that, which is kind of flat. Like the epicenter of the bubble was Melbourne, Victoria, Australia's southerly most eastern state. And it pervaded in other places where local stock exchanges was set up to be like speculation vehicles in the gold rush. Obviously, after the Second World War, there were a number of government programs that were aimed at ensuring that returning war veterans and then subsequently baby boomers were able to get into a house. We'll come back to that. Australia's also been a immigrant nation. Obviously, I'm a European. I'm of European descent, and the reason why I got here is because my ancestors got on a boat um, from Scotland and England and traveled half the world, traveled around the world to get here. Um, so the large, I think still the largest ethnic group is uh, Australians of European descent or one form of another. And then that's being closely followed up by some of these South Asian communities that have immigrated in more recent years. Um, Up until the 1960s and 70s, the immigration policy into Australia was explicitly racist. So, um, yeah, the government called it the White Australia policy. It was even pretty discriminatory towards Southern Europeans. So at the time, it became controversial that Italians and Greeks were allowed to immigrate to Australia in great numbers. So it just kind of shows you how far we've come. Um, in the 1960s and 70s, there were much more progressive and left-wing governments, which overturned a lot of the, you know, traditionally racist and sexist exclusionary policies. So you had things like turn back in sexual discrimination in terms of gender discrimination, in terms of racial discrimination. That this kind of set the fore for big changes in Australia's immigration policy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when policymakers, mostly in the federal bureaucracy, determined that Australia would not be able to sustain normal population or growth oriented population growth without significantly more immigration than had been the case. There have been waves of immigration over the last obviously since Australia's been founded as a colonial project. Before 2000, I think that number was somewhere in the realms of 50,000 people per year. After the late 1990s, that kind of got ratcheted up to 100,000, sort of the 100,000 number. That it varies a little bit depending on what the economy is doing and so forth. And then after the pandemic, when Australia experienced one of the few moments of declining population growth in its history, they opened the floodgates like to an unbelievable degree. So in the last couple of years, there have been hundreds of thousands in terms of net immigration. I think the last 12 months up to February of this year was 500,000. And I think in the 12-month period before that, it was over 600,000. Someone can double check me on the numbers, but the net number of people who have been showing up is, approaching / exceeding 500,000 people a year. Australia is a country of 27 or so million persons. There are 6 or 7 large metropolitan areas. 3 or 4 of those are significantly large, so more than 2 or 3 million. And so there's been an enormous amount of net overseas migration. The domestic birth rate is on par with any other developed Western country in that we are well below the birth rate. And when the immigrants show up, they also adopt this same characteristic. So they also, get to a birth rate of like 1.4, 1.3, something like that. And so, in the kind of GDP brained growth analysis of, people who study economics at university, you just have to keep ratcheting that number up to keep the to keep the GDP growth going. And that has been a massively supported. This has been a feature of Australian life, and then it's just kind of like gone into numbers which are baffling, and it's very difficult for the country as a whole to deal with the number. It's enormous. It's like we're having a large regional area in terms of population deposited every year. The vacancy rate in most Australian cities is at levels which are quite difficult to fathom, less than 1% in many capital cities. This is a serious issue. Why housing is a problem, accessing housing is a problem, the rental market's a complete mess, and this is like a one of these fixed costs that people experience in their life, and it obviously affects people who are earlier in their career or less socio-economically well off. It also has incredibly deleterious social effects, but we'll leave that to the side for the moment. Up on the screen, there's this tweet I tweeted a couple of weeks ago. If you talk to anyone about housing in Australia, they all have their like take on it. Some people are completely ambivalent to the fact that the housing is expensive. Um, I've had many conversations with people who are very economically well off who don't even believe that we're having a housing crisis, which is amusing. But at a certain level of wealth, you get completely detached from inflationary pressures on the bottom end. Um, so everyone's got their own idea, but the explanation for it is it's a lollapalooza, as Charlie Munger would say. There's a enormous number of factors pushing in one direction to achieve this like kind of crazy and you know somewhat inexplicable outcome. It kind of defies logic. I take issue with people who call our housing situation a bubble. A bubble, by definition, is a state of affairs which is detached from economic reality. Uh, there are perceptions, there are expectations. People act on perceptions and expectations. The fundamentals of the situation diverge wildly from that, and that creates a bubble. A bubble also kind of implies there's going to be a pop. You know, perception and reality must meet. Perception converges to reality. Um, in the case of housing, that's perception and reality are actually quite similar. This is not a properly functioning market for the most part. There is supply and demand have been well and truly gamed by the authorities, through their proxies at the banks and the kind of large ecosystem that exists around both to um, support all this. So, um, it's not necessarily a bubble. It's kind of difficult to see how it actually gets corrected until there are policy changes. In the large part, I mean, this is a situation created by policy, and so policy changes actually will affect it. And the way that it will get remediated will be through like letting actual market forces come to bear on the residential housing market. There's in a properly functioning market system, there is supply and demand, and there are probably like a couple of big forces that come to play on a typical Western residential housing market. One would be obviously the supply of housing. This has historically been a big issue because at the moment that a person becomes a house owner, a HOOMer even, they also become a person who does not want any more supply. If you buy an apartment in a residential area, that's the last apartment building that you want built because you don't want any more supply of apartments. More supply of apartments, as most people rightly know, will drive down the price of apartments. If you're in a low density area, you don't want that to become a high density area because there's more supply by definition, which will affect the price of what is very likely your largest asset on margin, right? Mortgages. Most people use a mortgage to buy a house. So there's supply and there's obviously demand. Now, demand can be gamed as well. Obviously, a big part of demand is people's, what people earn and their wages and the quality of those and predictability of those earnings. So, um, the bankers in Australia love to lend to government employees because they can't get fired, and it's very likely that that employee will get substantial pay rises over time, which has been the norm recently. We'll also get into this. Um, Bankers don't like lending to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs can go bankrupt. They can have periods in their life when they don't have any cash flow, even though the aggregate amount of cash flow they might generate in their life is much higher than, let's say, a government employee. It might be. Um, the government employee, the well-paid government employee, is a much better credit for the most part. Now, as wages increase, you would assume, all things being equal, that the purchasing power of those employees goes up. And so that's kind of like this old Western economy idea where people think that over the long term, house prices will converge with wage growth, and that was certainly true for a period of time. Probably in the post pandemic period, and certainly in the post COVID period. Sorry, in the post GFC period, but certainly in the post COVID period. Um, you know, Productivity is down for about eight straight years in a row on a per capita basis. Um, Wages really haven't kept up with house prices. Many house prices have doubled. Many residential property markets have doubled over the period, which has been a wide convergence um, between that. Obviously, wage growth is not the only factor in demand. There's things like credit availability, what the interest rate is, the amount to which a lending institution is willing to actually lend someone, as a proportion of their income. And then there are all sorts of other demand-based considerations like first home buyers grants, government subsidized loans, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of way that side can be gamed. So in the late 1990s, there was basically this consensus built up between both the Liberal and Labor parties. That would be the traditional centre right and centre left political party. That no one's upset when their house price goes down. So that was a observation of John Howard, who was a Liberal centre right politician of the late 1990s, and the '08 period, so the noughties period up until the GFC. Many policy, decisions from about this point would come to support house prices in one way or another. The late 1990s and 2000s was like kind of like the golden age for boomers. Their parents and the generation between them and their parents had retired from the workforce. They were, probably in some of their highest earning years. They were having families. Well, the ones that had families had families. Um, and kind of, they were entering decade sort of three or four of the maybe two or three of the world, just getting automatically better every decade. As I mentioned before, this kind of big Australia consensus, various policies supported that, but this big Australia consensus ratcheted up immigration, um, and a number of these demand and supply side dynamics in the actual market itself sort of um, we're being set. There are all kinds of tax breaks for the house that you own and live in. There are all sorts of demand side policies to support first home buyers. So this can be up to like 50,000 in cash, and a de facto government guaranteed 2% down mortgage. These kind of things started to proliferate, which have just kind of ratcheted up to almost hilarious levels post pandemic. So there's an intergenerational um, element to this. There's the first thing here is APRA lending standards. So APRA is, the de facto bank regulator, and they determine how much of, how many times someone's income can be lent to someone, and broadly the broad lending standards that people would qualify for a mortgage for. There's important psychosocial things to be cognizant of. These many of these issues are kind of like, have attracted like hedge funds over the years who thought that Australia would be like a great, like the Big Short 2.0. And it's been a widowmaker for like, 20 or yeah, almost 30 years. Turn up, I can't believe how much some of these houses are, as compared to local incomes. We should short this. Um, and just never seems to happen, mostly because, again, people look at one, they get over indexed on like one causal factor, and there's just like hundreds of supporting causal factors. So it's like a hydra. You cut one of the heads off, and like three other heads appear. And, just kind of like running around with your head cut off, thinking that, if we cut this one head of the hydra off, it's going to like cause a collapse, which is just not true. Just not true. Canada was very similar. Even during 2008, the residential housing market dipped. It had a slight dip before it, continued its inevitable march upwards. That wasn't even a recession year for the Australian economy. The last time Australia had a recession outside of the initial, uh, response to COVID was 1992. 1992. So that's 34 years ago. And a lot of these big government heavy-handed policies in hand with a couple of major mining booms, have sort of allowed this to happen. Internally, a lot of people like to refer to Australia as the lucky country, and you know, kind of looks like the luck's running out. You can only pull forward so much, um, good economic outcomes, and these sort of things are starting to turn into reverse. The underlying economy, it would not be wrong to equate Australia to like a petro state, to Saudi Arabia, maybe a African republic that derives most of its revenues from, or whatever natural resource they have in abundance. Historically, the country was a lot more diversified than it used to be. There was all sorts of manufacturing used to happen here, steel manufacturing. We used to refine gas here. Um, you name it, like any, kind of like mid, developed economy after World War II. It was car manufacturing that happened for a while, and so on. Basically, the story of the last 30 years has been not that dissimilar from any other Western country, where most of the low end manufacturing we just simply outcompeted on. We're very far away from the rest of the world. There's not a super large population here, and the influence of you know uh, the left wing labor movements had just priced labor out of the market. So um, whatever manufacturing that has been supported in the last 30 years here has been supported via government subsidy. Where does the government get the money to make these subsidies from? And, just massively over indexed on minerals. But it's not even like we're expanding minerals. It's like we've got, iron ore, coal, other mineral mines were developed in deep antiquity, before the turn of the century. And we're just kind of in runoff mode for all of those. So there really hasn't been any new mines opened in the Bowen Basin. There's been scarce few new iron ore mines opened in Western Australia in the last couple of years. And a lot of the coal mining in New South Wales and in Victoria is long for this world. We stopped drilling for gas a long time ago. Sorry, for petroleum a long time ago. And there was a bit of a gas renaissance that occurred for a while, and the greenies made sure that we don't get any more of that. So there is like a very stark contradiction in the country in that the actual value that we provide to the world, which is in the most part very high grade metallurgical and thermal coal, as well as some of the best iron ore on the planet, that really supports the standard of living that we enjoy here, which is still pretty high, but directionally getting worse. You have that kind of like juxtaposed against the tertiary education institutions indoctrinating young people in like green communism, which is it's like very it's like it's quite something to behold. The thing that is actually means that you can afford food this week is also the thing that you're protesting against. So we kind of have this lunacy stuff, which is really contradictory. But you can kind of think about Australia that way. It's a mine in runoff. It's a big mine in runoff. We're not opening any, for the most part, we're not opening any new mines, and the economic benefits of the mine are being shuffled into a very large bureaucracy and welfare state, which is at this point the majority of the economy. So it's more than 50%, which is endemic. There are very large welfare programs that are, specifically the NDIS, which are being massively rorted. There's endemic corruption in some of these things, and even the large bureaucracies, they haven't experienced any productivity gains since I think it's 2000, the turn of the century. So yeah, you can kind of think about it. So it's actually quite a typical petro state in that regard. Part of the reason for the wider productivity decline, there is this thing where the taxes are very high, the labor is very expensive. We've not really invested much money at all post 2000 in actually developing value added services, really of any kind. And what what we really have done is arrange a taxation and economy, a taxation and regulatory environment in which, the surest way to, accumulate wealth, at least on paper, is through residential property. And so this feeds into the psychosocial dynamic. If you're not from Australia, or maybe you're Australian and you've left, or you're Australian and you're still here, if you've ever gone to like a family barbecue, or you're with your friends, go over to your friend's place for a barbecue. There's 20, 30 people there, whatever. You're having a beer and a sausage and bread, and you see a bloke you haven't seen in a while. G'day, mate. How are you? How are things going? Da, da, da. Probably within the first 3 minutes of that conversation, property will come up. This bloke who is a welder, he's a works in the mines, he is a bureaucrat, whatever. He can probably tell you what the cash rate is. He can tell you what suburbs have performed best in terms of capital growth. He can't tell you what the cap rate is of any residential property, because that's not necessary. I have a friend who's a valuer who like literally his job is to value property for one of the big 4 professional services firms, and like 3 or 4 years into the job, I asked him what the cap rate was on some property. He was like, and he didn't know what a cap rate was. Like he couldn't tell you what the what the net yield on the property. Well, he didn't have a conception of it. His conception was how much more is it going to be worth. And to be fair, that's not completely off the point, because as we're gonna find, at least residential property is very divorced from what most valuation matrices would like, frameworks would kind of like imply. So anyways, if you're at a barbecue, property comes up like right away. It's the main topic of conversation. Most young people, so if you're like well, you'd be like lucky to get into a house now at 25. But if you're like 25 to 40, you've got it's very likely you've been like pressured into buying a house, either by social conditioning or maybe, your partner is very anxious to buy a house for whatever reason. Um, and so this is this is like the biggest thing in most people's lives. Um, in that age, in like the social conditioning aspect, if you go to like a wider family get together and you're a youngish adult. I'm leaving young adulthood, unfortunately. But your uncle, your aunt will be one of the first questions I'll ask is, oh, when are you buying a place? Are you buying? Are you looking, etc. Certainly at the point where you get a serious long-term partner, people will start to put the screws on about settling down and buying a house. People will own a house and not even plan to live in it. Like, I mean, like, you have this kind of, especially if you end up in these hothouse professional services firms after university and these big corporate environments, like the internal pressure to buy a house is so great that you have this kind of thing where people buy a house that they can't even afford to live in. So they'll buy a house that they can't afford to live in by themselves. They will rent the house out, and then they will, the cap rates don't make sense. So you'll be flat on the rent as opposed to what it costs you to carry the investment property. And then you'll supplement that with your income, and then you'll rent a place. So like a very common setup for like a 25, 26, 27, 28-year old Australian who's keen on getting ahead, they will, you know, you'll either save up money for a few years. Maybe your parents will throw you some cash, so you'll tap the bank of mum and dad, and then you'll go and buy a place, right, which you can't service yourself. So we'll explain into how this even happens in the first place. You think it'd be like impossible to buy too much of a house, like a house that you literally cannot afford to make the mortgage repayments on. But you'll go and do this. You'll buy the house, rent it out to like four people or something like that, and charge rent for it. The rent doesn't cover the carry. You'll top up the carry with your salary, and you'll be sharing an apartment with like three other people. And this is how you're going to get ahead. Very common. This is very, very common. So there's this psychosocial, like continual bid on housing because people just think that this is like the only thing that matters. Leads into this like absurd idea of like the property ladder. The property ladder. It's a ladder to nowhere, but it's basically this idea that, you know, at all times in your life, when and your borrowing capacity comes into this, but you start off with a starter home that's like a bit of a fixer upper, or it's in not such a nice neighborhood, or it's the best house in a not so nice neighborhood, or whatever. You buy in like an entry level place, and then as you accrue more equity in it, so as the value of that house goes up, and as you get raises at work, you might have an inheritance, you might get a gift from your childless aunt and uncle, whatever it is, you kind of take the equity out of that house plus whichever other wealth you've been able to accrue, and then you roll that into the next house. And you're pretty much just expected to do this like your whole life. And people do this. They literally just keep rolling the equity into a bigger and bigger and bigger house, depending on one, how much equity they have, and two, what their borrowing capacity is. And so you literally live your whole life to service debt on a house on the assumption that it will just go up into infinity. And to be perfectly fair, to be honest, for the last 34 years, that's been a really good bet. It's been a one-way bet. But it never sort of like comes to an end until it comes to an end. And as I've already said, so many things are like gaming the market that it's very hard to see how they're like remediating factors come into play in a serious way, in like a very serious way. So that's like another odd part of the puzzle Um, yeah, so like to put into perspective, just why people think this is a bubble. I think it's a bubble because the housing is very expensive, and it's expensive compared to the incomes that you can earn if you live depending on where you live. So Sydney would be like a very extreme example where Sydney is like one of the most beautiful cities on the planet. Um, if you've never been, you should make the trip down to go at least once. And it's generally speaking, like if you want to have a nice standard of living in Sydney and actually live in a nice part of Sydney, you probably need to be a deca millionaire. Um, this is expecting that you'd live in a nice suburb, you would own your own house, you'd have a couple of kids, and you'd send the kids to private school, um, like to a good school, because there's a big bifurcation between private education and public education in Australia. And you didn't want to live, hilariously far away from where you worked. That kind of setup, that's millions of dollars off the bat, millions of dollars off the bat. Um, so it's a really nice place, but it's also a very extreme place in terms of the cost of living. If you like ratchet it down a few and you take a place like Brisbane, where I live, you are looking at very typically you'll look at houses that are 10 plus times the median income. So the median income in Brisbane, I think the last time I checked, is 85 to 100 grand, something like that. I think the average salary is a little bit over 100 grand. And regularly 3, 4 bedroom houses in suburbs, which might be half an hour's drive from the city, you're looking at $500,000, sort of starter prices. Another funny aspect of the Australian housing market is our leading property portal. REA Group owns this, but it's realestate.com.au. This has some like hilarious number of registered users. Australia's like 27 million people, and the number of like monthly users is like 2/3 of the population or something like that. So it's like every adult has an account. Half the kids have an account. The intensity of user, like the engagement of the site is like it's verging on um, I don't like Fortnite levels of engagement for its like highest power users. Anyways, we just fired up a few properties here. We'll see if we can actually get the price on some of them. Yeah, so it's a 2 bedroom apartment in like a post-war building, like immediately post-war building. Oh, that's New Farm. Yeah, it's a nice suburb. Two better, one bath, two cars. That's 1.3 million. You're out in Wynnum there, so that's out in the bay. 3 bedroom, two bath, 1.3 million. That's actually not the worst deal, but that's half an hour, 40 minutes drive into the city. 1.4 at Castledine. Yeah, that's deep up in the north side. That's almost on the way to the Sunshine Coast. Yeah, it's 4 bedrooms. 1.4 million, 2 bedroom apartment in Castledine as well. Castledine is not a place you would want to live. You know, 20-30 minute drive from the north side of Brisbane. 2 bedroom apartment there going for 650 grand. So, just put that kind of into perspective in a suburban area in a relatively big city. Half an hour's drive from the city, you're looking at, kind of 1.5 million median incomes are like 86 grand, average incomes are 110 grand. So even if you do make a decent income, it probably needs to be you and like a girlfriend slash wife together, and you both need to be making pretty good money to kind of, buy one of these places outright. The rents are kind of a little bit detached from this because of partially negative gearing, but partially just because rents are a lot more reflective of incomes than house prices are. Just because if you're going to rent a place, you need income to do it. They literally, it's difficult for them to be detached. the detachment in house prices versus incomes, there's obviously a way in which there's a psychosocial thing going on there. The banks are willing to lend a lot of money to people. There's a lot of mortgage fraud. Um, People are using mortgage brokers who are helping them like game some of the lending parameters. Mum and dad are throwing down 300-400 grand for kids to buy a house. In the worst case scenario, they're daisy chaining equity from their existing house. So you get married, you've got your partner, mum and dad have paid off their house. The house is now worth 2 mil. To help you, this a brand new couple get into housing, mum and dad borrow 400 grand against the 2 mil. They give you the 400. You take the 400 as a down payment to buy a house because you know these kind of things are happening. There's immigrants coming in paying with cash. We'll we'll get into some of these other things. So this is Brisbane. This has been like a hot property market in the last 12 months or so. Sydney's been a very hot market for a very long time. Melbourne's come down quite a bit because they've started to introduce land tax. Wink, wink. That's what's coming next. Um, yeah. So on any objective measure, the housing's pretty expensive. To even give the craziest, you know, housing market some perspective, in Australia, the top 1% of income earners. So if you take the top 1% of income earners, and obviously this is going to be subject to a massive power law. So, don't hold that against me. But the median income in the top 1% is about 350 grand. And I think that's at the household level. So you're in the median, you're in the middle median of the top 1% of income earners, and you're on 350. And even at that level, that's 4 to 5 times kind of like a sort of mediocre place you wouldn't really want to live. 30 or 40 minutes drive from a C tier capital city. Someplace that you actually might want to live if you were making out, if you were doing really well in your job, and let's say you were making 350. The house you wanted to live in is probably $2 to $3 million. Easily. In any event, I digress. So the point is, I had this set up, whatever. Why is this the way that it is? We live on an enormous continent. The continent's roughly the size of North America. Sorry, the United States. There's 27 million people here. What the hell's going on? So there's obviously this historical thing where there's been a big emphasis on buying houses. Houses, certainly in the post-pandemic period, there were, and before that at various periods, but there have been loosening of APRA lending standards. So at various points in time, banks would lend, so big commercial banks. So there's a banking oligopoly, that's another issue, but for the most part, a lot of loans are being issued by the consolidated large banking sector, so 4 large banks. And at various points, these people would, lend you 6, 7, maybe even 8 times your annual income. So all things being equal, if a bank is willing to lend you 8 times, what your income is, then all things being equal, house prices should go for about 8 times income. Now, those are like kind of crazy, like 6 or 7, 8 times is incredibly, that's a big multiplier, and certainly bigger than what it is in a lot of other Western countries. Now, they've obviously come in and they've been tightening some of these things in the last 12 months because many of the housing markets do look like they're out of control. But the other thing that lends into that is obviously there's quite obviously widespread mortgage fraud occurring, and not of the most crazy in criminal mortgage fraud, like where people are intentionally attempting to defraud lending institutions. It's not just that. It's that housing is so competitive. Call it competitive. It's expensive that even people are just going to stretch the information that they provide to their lender, or if they're using a mortgage broker, that mortgage broker is very likely to kind of actively help them, game the system. Like, oh, if you pay down this, and then you put a little bit more here, and you know, oh, you got a big bonus that week. Okay, we'll use that pay slip, to verify the income. This kind of thing is going on. Everything across that gamut is happening as people reach and reach. And like, I had friends who their first job out of university was to be like a lending officer at one of the big banks, and this was pre-COVID, and it was just very, like it's obvious that these people's their bonuses are tied to how many loans they make, simple incentive structure. And so they're quite incentivized to make sure people get loans. And so you have these like incredible stories of over a couple of beers that kind of tell you that they lent $750,000 to a personal trainer who could only prove $1,000 worth of income in the last year. Those things were quite common, and I'm guessing in the post COVID period, these things have only gone into overdrive. As I mentioned before, there's things like parents daisy chaining equity. The more common thing is probably that a lot of boomers do have their house paid off, and so they've also been able to save quite a lot. So this thing where your parents might throw you a few $100,000, $50,000, whatever, throw you a bit of cash to help you with your down payment is very prevalent. And depending on how wealthy your parents are, they might actually just buy the house for you in cash, or they might borrow the money and you like pay them back, this kind of thing. Not discussed is there's a non-economic bid. There's a non-economic marginal bid. So we have some sort of immediacy to China, to Southeast Asian countries. Indonesia's one of our closest neighbors. And Australia is a very, for the most part, it's a very safe rule of law country where the likelihood that the government explicitly seizes your wealth or seizes all of it in one day is very low. Property rights are very well respected. So you do have this dynamic where oligarchs in Asia, their kids, their nephew, whatever, getting residency and buying a house as part of getting residency, and coming to do like getting a degree at a degree mill in our tertiary education sector. These are things that are like quite valuable to them, aside from whether or not they even make money on the property. So if you're like a Malaysian billionaire and there's a 35% chance that you're there's like some kind of government crackdown done on whatever shady business practices you're up to, having some property in Australia is quite a good thing. You can get residency here without too much trouble buying property, and if things go haywire, Australia is a good place to come and dodge the heat. This is like a very common thing for like the kids of oligarchs from Papua New Guinea. I went to school with many of them. Getting your money out of Papua New Guinea and placing it into a bunch of Australian residential real estate has been a good trade for many decades now. In any event, it does create this dynamic where we'll take Brisbane for example. You're working and living in Brisbane, earning Brisbane wages, and to buy housing, you might very well be competing with like a Chinese billionaire. If you go to any of these property auctions, so I mentioned this at the start, a very common way for people to sell property here is literally at an auction. So they stand in front of the house and people literally bid on it in like a hothouse fashion for the highest price. For the highest price. So this is like another this is like another dynamic of the market which just encourages higher prices. If you bid in one of these, it's that one of these elements of human misjudgment where you have like you think you've bought the house and then someone steals it away from you with their bid, and you have this like super reaction to this dynamic, and you bid even more even though you can't afford it. This kind of thing happens, but ultimately, if you go to any of these auctions, you know 1 in 20 of the attendees is likely, like, was born in Australia, and the other 19 people are of various nationalities, and they're quite often on the phone to their dad. Oh, we've got to go to 2 mil to get this. They're obviously not speaking English. And what do you think? And they just, what do they care? $2, $3 million. It doesn't matter to them. Um, Australia's a great place to live as well. So people are willing to really pay through the nose to live in some of the better places, especially with immediacy to a beach or some of the great natural attractions. So you kind of have this thing happening as well. For a long time, for a long, long time. I think they've only very recently started to change some of this, but um, like if you were here on a tourist visa, right, like a 90-day tourist visa or something, and you were able to get a hold of 2 million bucks in cash, you could basically just turn up to a property auction, right? Bid on the house, hand the cash over, write whatever name you wanted to on the deed, and you would own the house. There would be no, if you wanted to pay in cash, there's no KYC, there's no proof of funds stuff. So you really do have this unfettered competition, like global competition for real estate in the area where you may have been born, work, live, and pay taxes versus someone who's doing none of those things. Very common, very common. Yeah, not discussed either is a structurally increasing replacement cost inflation. So this has really become an impediment to the creation of low cost housing. But certainly since the late 2010s, the cost of building materials has skyrocketed enormously. This has created a dynamic where most of the new apartment blocks that are going up are a luxury. So, quite often you look at one of these new apartment blocks, and they will be in a good suburb, there's no doubt about that. But you might be looking at like a one-bedroom apartment. It might not even have a car park, and it's got no view of the river, so it's not facing the river. It might just be facing onto like quasi industrial area, and that apartment might be going for like 1.5 mil, 1.3 mil. So when even when you do have new supply being brought on, and Australia does bring a lot of supply on, it's just that, as we mentioned, the rate of new housing demand being spurned on by immigration is just far greater than the nation can create new housing units. In any event, when this new supply is being brought on, it's not really that helpful to the existing stock because if your floor for new supply is at luxury levels, it just means that that becomes the clearing price. It's not like you're ever going to get into a situation where a lot of these luxury buildings are fully built, and then the developer is like forced to liquidate the property, and you have this like lower clearing price. Many developments that go awry, the developer of the building simply holds on to the units until the market gets them to whatever economic return that they're looking to earn. And so this has been like kind of really the only that you see apartment blocks going up in a lot of eastern cities, but a lot of them are like Meritons. Meriton is like a luxury apartment developer. Greyer, if you're deep into the industry, they're putting up apartment blocks left, right, and center. Those are very luxury apartments. And so it's not, it doesn't do anything for the lower end of the market. And so that's kind of like where we are right now. All things being equal, as replacement costs rise, all other things must rise with it. If you have existing housing stock that has a lower that was built with a lower replacement cost, but the existing replacement cost is 2x that, all things being equal, that price is going to come up, which has been the case. I mean, even apartments have been doing well, which is, that's like anathema to most people in the property industry. The experience of apartments, especially off the plan, is that they really go one way, and that's down. Unfettered immigration, yes. So we mentioned that. So this sort of dynamic, you can see it kind of in the United in North America. So the United States looks like it's going to have maybe its first period of negative population growth in many, 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 many years. Canada has been kind of trying to get rid of people overstaying their visas and not issuing new ones. Their rental market has kind of followed in that, and it looks like some of the most bubbly residential housing markets have kind of deflated a bit, kind of where they were around about the pandemic. New Zealand, very similar. Um, they've sort of turned the corner on the whole immigration thing. The United Kingdom and Europe look as though they're on the cusp of doing something about this as well. Australia, on the other hand, has just gone full bore, import like 2% a year or so, something crazy, like a low single digit percentage of the population every year. We're just going to keep going on with this. And it obviously supports house prices because if you import far more people, then new supply can be brought online. All things being equal, demand for housing goes up, and you kind of have this dynamic at the moment where people who are in their 30s are living with their parents because either getting a rental is too expensive or difficult. If you ever go to go to a rental inspection, even this whole thing's kind of like a bit of a lark, but you go to a reasonably nice 1 or 2 bedroom rental inspection, there'll be 30 or 40 people show up. Usually the place has been rented, it's already been rented 3 or 4 minutes after it's been put up on one of the property portals. And the amount that you'll pay for that rental is sort of converging on where like a first year grad salary would be, a good grad salary. um, you know you, so you have that in the rental market, and then obviously that is the same for the existing stock of housing that's on the residential sale market. You mentioned this. There's a large panoply of first home buyer grants. So this is basically you sum this all up in a kind of supported demand side policies. But if you're a first home buyer in most of the states, the state government will chip in as much as maybe 50,000 Australian dollars, to help you with your deposit. Federally and statewide, there are certain guarantee, mortgage guarantees. So the most egregious one that they've rolled out most recently is, if you're a first home buyer, you can put 2% of the property down, and the government will basically come along and guarantee the next 18%. So that gets you to the 20% hurdle where you can where you can skirt lenders' mortgage insurance. So this is this additional cost that if you don't put 20% down, you need to pay some, insurance fee in the case that you default. The government's come down and said, forget LMI, you can put 2, we'll have the 18, and so the effect of that has been that, a lot of these first home buyers, these naive young people are, they think they're getting on the property ladder. They're really levering themselves up 50 to 1 into a house, and they have like a massive interest rate exposure. What happens, what happens in the event of a default, with the government is a bit of like we'll kind of see how that plays out. But really, at almost any sign of a downturn in the market, the state and federal authorities sort of come out with another demand side hit to try and keep the party going. There's so many of these, and at certain periods they are. It's so it's so crazy what they are encouraging. Basically some very naive young people to do, and I feel so bad for them. Not just it's not that I necessarily think the price is going down, but even you have had to borrow that full amount, and you are on the hook for the interest payments. And many of these people, even if they don't default on the property, are sort of in for a life of indentured servitude as they work for their house and for the holder of their mortgage. We mentioned owner-occupied tax exemption. So this is the principal place of residence exemption. So, really, at this point, the most tax advantaged vehicle that you can put marginal capital towards is the house in which you live, the residential house in which you live. It is not subject to capital gains. It's all property tax, to the extent that property taxes do exist, those do not exist on your existing house. Probably have to pay some local government rates, for water and rubbish pickup and whatever else. But for the most part, that house is tax exempt, and most other capital gains are, kind of at the top end. They're taxed at about 25% if you hold the asset for more than a year, something like that. And the government is floating, basically having long-term capital gains converge on personal income tax rates. The highest rate of personal income tax is about 48, 50%, can be over 50 depending on, if you don't get private health insurance and that kind of thing. But, um, um, you know, and usually those top tax rates, they hit in at, 130, the equivalent of 130 US dollars. It's about 180, 190,000 Australian dollars. So a little more than 100 grand in proper dollars. So in the case you've accumulated any kind of considerable assets, kind of floating a 50% tax rate on that, and that's just another lever, right? If you're looking at realizing some gains in your portfolio and what to do with that money, the obvious case is to put it into renovations on an existing house, because it's so tax advantaged. You do have this kind of um, bizarre dynamic where older Australians who've been living in these houses, typically they've done no renovations on them. This is like a very common thing. Boomers, because they are so home-brained, and they've just, you dedicate 100% of your paycheck to servicing the biggest house you could possibly get yourself into. That leaves very little money for capital expenditures on the house. And so, and certainly within retirement, because there's relatively there's not much cash coming in the door, you can't afford to do them up. And so you have kind of like the extreme home thing on the one end, where a lot of the houses haven't been renovated in 50 years, 60 years, something like that. And then on the other end, you have these younger people who are very levered up into their house. And because, the house that they've bought off the boomer is like falling apart, they have to do the renovations because they got to live there for more than a couple of years. And on the other hand, actually investing money into the house is very tax advantaged when you come to sell it. So it kind of makes sense to do some of these renovations as opposed to making any other kind of investment. And so you kind of have crippled, destroyed houses on one side, and then massively overcapitalized houses on the younger side. And I mean, this is just another reason why the house is so expensive as compared to some of these mass manufactured homes in America. The manufactured homes are cheap because it costs like 100 grand to put the house up on top of the land once you buy the land, and it's all made of like chipwood, and like in a strong breeze it might all fall over. In the other hand, in Australia, the houses are hilariously overcapitalized. Like they're like palaces inside. There's like, quartz dining tables. Everything's, like it's in the most fashionable design. All this kind of thing. So the tax exemptions on the house, force a lot of marginal capital into it on an opportunity cost basis. And to be fair, if they get this new tax, if what they say that they want to get this new tax thing passed, I might consider buying a house. It might get that extreme. Right. We mentioned the auction thing. The auction thing is ridiculous. I mean, selling a house in an auction, it's just a mechanism to try and get the silliest price out of someone. You also have this like crazy thing where you can actually bid in your own auction. So let's say you're selling your own home. Your reserve price is 1.5. It's called 1.5. You got 20 bidders. It gets to 1.6. You go, oh, I'll put an owner bid in at 1.7 because I want to get the price up. And basically you're saying, I'm going to buy this house off myself at 1.7. It's effectively saying, I'm not going to accept, me in the spur of the moment, I've decided to not accept a price well above my reserve. You have this kind of thing. go on. So this, yeah, like it's completely out of control. Um, yeah, okay. Something we didn't mention was like NIMBY planning authorities. This has become less of a problem in the last couple of years, sort of as the boomers have begun to expire. But for many years, if you wanted to do a development in an area, it has to go through like a gajillion planning, committees, etc. You have these hilarious examples where they have a planning meeting scheduled for like 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. Anyone who would benefit from a higher density building going through in a residential area, they're obviously at work. All of the retired boomers with nothing else to do are obviously aggrieved that someone wants to put like three townhouses up in their low density area. They all turn up, they're all angry, they yell at the planning people, and bingo, bango, bongo, they say the community doesn't want this. In more recent years, and this is like very recently, that's the last 3 or 2 years, state governments have begun to intervene in this, and they've basically been overruling councils who obstruct a new supply, and they're saying get new supply online. There are holdouts. There are like the classic example is like eastern suburbs in Sydney, where these ostensibly quite wealthy and well established older boomer Australians fight tooth and nail so that no more new builds go up. Less of an issue, but the bottom line to a lot of these local planning inquiries is that if you buy a house in an area, an apartment, like I said before, after you sign the deed, you become a hoomer straight away. You don't want your house price to go down. New supply is gonna hurt the value of my house. So you become obstructionist right away. And because you're the ratepayer and because you're motivated, you will lobby the local planning authorities not to do any of this. This contrasts so differently than what things used to be in like the 1970s and 80s. My dad was a property developer, and like if you bought a piece of land on Friday, you could be building on Monday. You know, you basically you had to you wrote out a couple of forms, dropped them into the council, and away you went. And now it's like a several month thing, and complete disaster for the most part. Right, we talked a lot about government demand side stimmies to any perceived downturn. This has been the reflexive action of every government to every property downturn is to up demand through some of these first home buyers grants, etc. Helicopter money and importing hundreds of thousands of new immigrants. Like you would kind of wonder, like when you do defend local asset prices, there has to be a release valve in a globalized economy, and for the most part, that's been the Aussie dollar. So every federal government, who is, has the most effect on, the dollar and monetary policy. Obviously, monetary policy is set by the RBA, but the successive governments have basically been willing to defend local asset prices, so let's say the residential property market, at the expense of the currency. How does this manifest? Well, Australia currently, it's kind of got like, it's got on par now a government cash rate on about at the level of the United States, but that's a recent phenomenon. This country's had a lower interest rate than the US for like 15 years before this, and it just makes absolutely no sense. Why should you have a lower cost of capital, all things being equal, in a petro state in runoff with 27 million people than you would have in the reserve currency country that has had far more robust GDP growth? Doesn't make any sense. And so the effect of that has been a declining Australian dollar against a basket of currencies. But that is kind of ameliorated this year, curiously, and maybe that has more to do with the US than it has to do with us, because we're going like straight off into the deep end in the policies which have gotten here. But they're very willing to trash the currency to support nominal onshore values. And if you measure house prices in US dollars, or you measure it in gold, or whatever other proxy of a currency you want, actually the asset prices have done quite poorly. So a lot of it is just monetary inflation kind of thing. Yeah, we talked about these like, bizarre psychosocial dynamics where it's like the immediate, topic of conversation. You can't ever escape it. Your parents, grandparents, friends, you know, if you haven't seen your parents' friends in, so your friends' parents in quite a while, quite the first thing they ask is, "Oh, have you bought a house yet?" It's you know, it's completely bizarre. And then it says, yeah, I could go on. So, that's kind of the thing. In one sense, it is a bubble because, things are very detached, but it's the thing to remember is that it's not a functioning market. Literally prices are being set by authorities, And so like when house prices go down and they step in to, pump them again, that is them setting the price. The most recent disclosure from the federal government, the very popular housing minister, um, she went on a radio program and said the explicit purpose of the explicit policy of the Australian federal government was to have house prices grow sustainably. So they have no interest in having them come down. This sort of spills over into productivity. So much capital just gets invested into housing instead of anything productive. Um, this is like a key. This is like how you refute Marxism. But in most free market economies, companies reinvest their profits or a portion of their profits, and that reinvestment historically into capex, has had returns greater than depreciation, right? So earnings grow greater than what you've spent, and what gets depreciated against income later on. That's how you have a successful market economy. Um, and there's just a way in which this kind of like the property thing, it sucks up so much marginal dollars. Like the funniest example of this was one of the local technology champions is Canva, and they had a big secondary offer. I think I want to say a year, 2 years ago, and there are all these millionaires, created overnight, Aussie dollar millionaires, and there was a lot of speculation about where oh, this is going to be there's going to be a massive wave of innovation as these new tech millionaires reinvest their money into the local economy, and they certainly did reinvest it, but most people took that money and they bought a property. Vaucluse was full of Canva employees. um, so yeah, you can't function like that. You can't, that is not how a modern economy functions. You don't just siphon off all economic value into an unproductive and negative yielding, like negative carry, like costs you quite a lot of money to own a house. um, and so that's a quick rundown on it. So that's HOOMS. It's um it's completely demented. I think it's ridiculous, um, bad for our society. Empirically now, it's been bad for like 10 years, and doesn't really look like anything is going to change. Probably the way they could take the most heat out of the market is to just stop importing so many people every year, because the vacancy rates are below 1% already. So we don't really have a lot of place to house anyone, even if they do turn up here. Forget how you even what your opinion is on immigration in the abstract. It's kind of irrelevant if you actually just there aren't any beds for these places for these new arrivals to live. And so maybe that's where the first crack comes down. They decide to kind of stop so much of this imported demand, and then maybe things might ameliorate. But it's kind of like very difficult to see housing become like a reasonable, a reasonable the clearing price of houses come down to a reasonable multiple of local earnings. Anyways, that's it. Enjoy your weekend. We'll be back next week.